Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. And I think we're about to get started. We still have a few people checking in, but we'll go ahead and get started. Um, and welcome everyone. Welcome back for those of you who have been with us on the previous two presentations. And if you are new, this is your first presentation, welcome. So I'm Teresa Hanley, and I'm the project director for the Toward Peace project. So I would like to welcome you to Riverside and the World, History and Memory of Peace and War. On behalf of the Mission Inn Foundation, thank you for attending our speaker series, which is a featured element of Toward Peace, which explores the peace activism of Mission Inn founder Frank A. Miller, the history of the Mission Inn and the legacies of both for us today, both as individuals and as a community. We are very proud that our project is made possible with support from California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. You can visit calhum.org, that's calhum.org, to learn more about them and the many fine programs they support throughout California. I would also like to thank our local sponsors, Judith Auth, Sally and Chuck Beatty, Kathy Wright and Dwight Tate, and Walter Parks. Thank you. Tonight, before we get started, I also wanted to take a few minutes to acknowledge and thank the Toward Peace Planning Committee. Since I'm usually the one that's appearing on these things, I want everyone to know who else has been working so hard on this project. I kind of mentioned last week that in 2017, I asked veteran Mission Inn docent Jerry Gordon to co-chair the group with me. We were soon joined by Vince Moses, Steve Spiller, and Emily McEwen, who are working to develop the exhibition portion of Toward Peace, which will open in the Mission Inn Museum later this year. Sally Beatty, also a longtime docent and former Mission Inn Foundation board president, coordinates the docent corps and assists on public programs. Several former foundation staff have also played key roles since 2017, including Karen Rains, Kanani Hopai, Rachel Morell, and Danielle Trinowski. I'm also very grateful to the Foundation's executive director, Jared Hoagland, who joined the Foundation in January of 2020 when Toward Peace was about to launch publicly. His executive and administrative support was immediate. His enthusiasm and talents in the tech area have been much appreciated as we reformatted the programs for the time of COVID-19. And of course, nothing would function at the Foundation without the work of Nancy Larson, and we thank her. So beginning tomorrow, we are looking forward to welcoming a new staff member, Education Coordinator Megan Keller, to our team. And several of our talented docents have also signed on to assist with evaluation and visitor services once we are able to hold in-person activities again. Thank you to all these folks for your dedication to the Foundation, this project, and our community. So now those of you who've been with us for a while kind of know the drill, but just in case there's anybody new with us, for Zoom housekeeping, your microphones are muted, and we have also disabled your cameras. This is to ensure that there's plenty of bandwidth and everybody has a quality reception. We also have disabled the chat function. So if you've been on other programs where you could use the chat function, you won't be able to do that tonight. But if you have a question, would you please type it into the Q&A. Jared and I will be monitoring those tonight, and Jared will handle anything that's a tech issue. And then I will be monitoring the questions, and we'll have our speaker address those at the end. So now it is my honor to introduce our speaker. Emily McEwen has been involved with the Mission Inn Foundation and Museum since 2007, when she started as a graduate intern. After her internship, she worked as the Foundation's curator of history, and the Mission Inn was also the focus of her 2014 PhD dissertation. For the last 2 years, she has been a dedicated team member and humanities advisor for Toward Peace. When not at work on Mission Inn projects, she is a historic resources consultant for Orange County Parks, where she is currently working on interpretive updates for the National Historic Landmark Helena Modjeska House. Tonight, she will take us on a deep dive into museum Mission Inn collections with internationalism, imperialism, and collecting tragedy at the Mission Inn. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Emily McEwen. Hello.
Hello. Let me share my screen real fast and we'll get started. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us tonight for the third installment of our Riverside and the World Speaker Series, as we continue to explore the local, national, and international contexts and ramifications of World War I. So as Teresa said, I've had the pleasure for the last 2 years of working as a humanities advisor for the Toward Peace Project. And it's so great to see the speaker series and the other project elements coming together despite COVID-19. So we really thank you for your support of this project and being here tonight on this St. Patrick's Day evening. So tonight I will be taking us to the immediate aftermath of World War I to examine a number of interconnected developments that unfolded in the post-war world. So we'll be looking at the ways in which American diplomats and politicians sought to spread American ideals across the war-torn European continent at the war's end, the impulse to immediately memorialize the war dead, as well as a side of the conflict that perhaps we don't consider all that often, the ways in which the war and the destruction wrought across the European continent was very much a boon for American art collectors and American museums. So Frank Miller, master of the inn, was an exuberant collector of art and material culture that he displayed throughout his hotel. And he often referred to his hotel as both a museum and a hotel. And here we have, if I can use my cursor here, we have a few examples from the hotel's earlier years. We have, of course, the mission and Native American influence in the lobby, items collected from Asia, as well as some examples from his extensive Bell collection, and of course the Spanish art gallery here, which was designed and decorated very much like a salon of a great hall in a European castle or noble house. And so Miller was really in the thick of a lot of these post-war developments that we will be discussing tonight. And so to get at these post-war historical processes, we're going to be looking at a single artifact, a wooden and bronze Calvary, which is a wooden cross that sculpturally depicts Christ's crucifixion, that made its way in September 1920 from a cathedral in Ypres, Belgium to Riverside. So by pulling apart the various historical threads and taking a deep dive into Miller's correspondence, the newspaper art accounts and shipping records, we can see through a case study of just one thing, how Miller, the Mission Inn, and Riverside are connected to so many important post-war developments. So if you're ready to take a trip with me, let's do it. So on September 11th, 1920, a 10.5-foot tall, 1.5-ton wooden and bronze cavalry arrived at the San Pedro port, having traveled from Antwerp, Belgium to New York and New York to Los Angeles aboard the SS Frederick Luckenbach. This cavalry, seen here adorning l'Église Saint-Pierre in Ypres, Belgium before the start of the war, was to be the central focus of a World War I memorial that Miller was planning for atop Mount Rubidoux. Miller's quest to build a war memorial on Mount Rubidoux began only 3 weeks after the November 11, 1918 armistice that decisively ended fighting. Concerned that the city would be, quote, carried away by misguided enthusiasm and, quote, erect a fantastic and ridiculous memorial, Miller and the other Riverside Chamber of Commerce directors passed a resolution on December 6, 1918 to spearhead the city's war memorial effort to commemorate the 87 soldiers in Riverside County who died in combat. They resolved to ensure that the community, quote, take great care in perfecting its plans for such a memorial as may properly express in a dignified and permanent manner Riverside's undying appreciation for the sacrifice of her noble sons and the world significance of the approaching peace settlement. So immediately following the Chamber of Commerce's declaration, Riverside's local press was abuzz with memorial proposals, vying for popular support from community groups. The ideas ranged from constructing a bridge across the Santa Ana River and building a new city hall adorned with memorial tablets, to placing an obelisk on the Riverside County Courthouse grounds, and Miller's plan for creating a grotto atop Mount Rubidoux featuring statues of Christ and a soldier of liberty. The Rubidoux Memorial is highlighted for its potential as a great tourist attraction, but the chamber warned that tourism should be of only secondary importance. And here we have a few examples of the newspaper accounts that were throughout the daily press and the Riverside Enterprise. And here we have a listing of some of the different community proposals. So city officials were charged with deciding the most appropriate way in which to honor the dead. As the Riverside proposals show, some sought to reaffirm citizenship through useful civic buildings and needed infrastructural improvements like the City Hall or the Santa Ana Bridge, while others wanted somber monuments where mourners could contemplate wartime sacrifices. While the ad hoc committee stated that tourism was not a priority, they strove for a memorial that would remember fallen soldiers and, quote, do credit to the fame of Riverside. So within days of the Chamber of Commerce's inaugural memorial meeting, Miller was advertising his Mount Rubidoux proposal to civic groups across Riverside in hopes of winning citywide support. On December 16th, just 10 days after that inaugural Chamber of Commerce meeting, he presented his plan to the Riverside Ministerial Union, divulging for the first time that he could secure, quote, a shrine from the devastated regions of Belgium to complete the memorial. Miller made sure to mention that his design had already received the splendid endorsement of prominent men throughout the country to whom he had confided his plans. The ministers voted unanimously to support Miller's Mount Rubidoux Memorial. So here we see, the Sarah Cross atop Mount Rubidoux, the Sarah plaque, and so his proposed memorial would be below these steps here. And of course, this Riverside Daily Press article talking about Miller's memorial plans and that the ministers of Riverside were giving them his full support. So the proposed shrine was composed of the Église Saint-Pierre's Calvary, seen here before the war. So it would be this piece right here, as well as statues of Mary and Peter flanking the Calvary that had been decapitated by artillery, all of which had decorated the Ypres Chapel's northern elevation before the church's bombardment. And here we have a few images of the Église Saint-Pierre before and after bombardment. You can see it was heavily hit both inside and out and required quite a bit of reconstruction to get it back functioning following the war. So rather than just listing names of Riverside's war dead on a newly constructed civic building or monument, as the other proposals suggested, Miller's memorial would include artifacts that bore witness to the devastation experienced by the local soldiers. And Belgium was at the center of the conflict's land battle. It was a cautionary tale for the horrors of total war. As one Belgium historian describes, the country, quote, experienced not only the horror of the trenches, but also the human shields and the massacres of around 5,000 civilians in August 1914, the destruction of several cities, the deportation of civilians in 1916, misery, hunger, and systematic pillaging during the occupation. At the end of the conflict, the nation was ruined and in mourning. Ypres, in Belgium's northwest corner, so if I can move my cursor right there, was the first region hit by Germany's gas warfare campaign, with tests beginning in October 1914 and a full-fledged attack starting on April 22nd, 1915. And we can see here, once again, the front snaking its way and going right past Ypres here. So throughout the war, the city and surrounding areas were the location of intense Western Front clashes between Allied and German forces that lay waste to the landscape. Soldiers in the Third Battle of Ypres from July to November 1917, for example, unleashed 4 million shells in the first 10 days of fighting. And after 3 months of stalemate, over 370,000 British troops were dead or wounded. Even into the late 1990s, and I find this figure just kind of blows my mind, each year nearly 250,000 kilograms of unexploded ordnance was extracted from the Ypres countryside. So at the war's conclusion, Ypres transformed into a place of pilgrimage for mourners who flooded the city to remember the dead and the missing. Here we can see a few examples of the devastation, these images of destroyed landscape, both in the city center here, and then the countryside and the landscape with the pits from the bombing. They really help visually sum up the destruction. As a well-known battle site subjected to the atrocities wrought by modern warfare, Ypres held a war-specific cultural significance. It was, as historian Paul Fussell notes, quote, a byword for a city totally destroyed. And so the relics that Miller secured from L'Église Saint-Pierre symbolized the Great War's incomprehensible violence and decimation. And so at the time that Miller was promoting his memorial plan and describing the artifacts from Ypres that it would feature, the city would have been well known to the populace as a place that had faced all the horrors that World War I had unleashed. And Miller's general design for the memorial focused specifically on the Calvary. He planned to situate it facing the rising sun in a semicircular sunken grotto cut from the living rock, 1,000 feet below the Serra Cross at Mount Rubidoux summit. His goal was to make the memorial not militaristic, but rather religious and sacrificial, befitting our central figure, as he said, the Belgian cross. And Calvaries were common elements of post-World War I memorials. The cross, with its imagery of Christ's crucifixion, represented the soldier's ultimate sacrifice, but also symbolized resurrection, rebirth, and redemption, signifying that the soldier's spirits lived on in heaven and that the world could heal itself. And also the popularity of Calvaries was further connected to the specific sense of place they evoked due to their ubiquity in the countryside of France and Belgium, with soldiers on the Western Front encountering them often throughout the landscape. The harm done to the Calvary's bronze corpus during the German bombardments was a potent testament to the bodily violence and disfigurement suffered by World War I troops. An August 1920 Riverside Daily Press article announcing Miller's purchase of the Calvary describes the sculpture of Christ as if it were an actual soldier, meticulously depicting in almost grotesque detail each wound inflicted by enemy fire. And this is directly quoted from this August 17, 1920 press article. Quote, upon the head of the statue is a large shell splinter. The throat has been torn away by another. Part of one arm from the elbow has been shot away, and a shell has gone through the calf of the right leg. Where this hole has been made, it can be seen that the legs are almost filled with a fine dust, presumably the dust of centuries, which has sifted in through the aperture at the back on which the statue was suspended from the cross. So the Calvary possessed this historical authority because of its age and its Belgian origin, but most importantly, because of its battle scars. It had seen the war. It had been damaged from the war. It was a witness to what had happened in Ypres and throughout the European continent. So how then did Miller come to secure this piece for his proposed Mount Rubidoux memorial that became the centerpiece of his memorial plans? And the answer to this has everything to do with both Miller's extensive networks and the creation of American relief agencies in the war's aftermath. And here's where we begin to flesh out all of this context and this great kind of web, historical web and network where we can begin to piece together these larger histories and contexts. And it gets very exciting as all of the pieces begin to fall into place. So Miller's choice of Belgian artifacts for his memorial reflected his interest in the plight of Belgian war victims, but was also a matter of connections and availability. So Miller acquired the St. Pierre Calvary through his relationships with diplomats Herbert Hoover and Perrin Galpin. So we see a young Herbert Hoover down here, and this rather fuzzy image, best I could do, is Perrin Galpin. So during the war, Hoover first rose to political prominence as chairman of the U.S. Commission for Belgian Relief from 1914 to 1917, and was then appointed by President Wilson to lead U.S. food rationing efforts as director of the U.S. Food Administration. And here we have a great, off to the left, a great poster from the U.S. Food Administration, helping Hoover in our U.S. school garden. So helping the war effort through harvesting your own food to ensure that everything is rationed and there's enough for abroad. And before serving as Secretary of Commerce under Presidents Harding and Coolidge, Hoover directed the disbursement of U.S. aid abroad as head of the post-war American Relief Administration. Galpin worked as an administrator of the Belgian Relief Commission in Brussels and Lille, served as Secretary of the American Relief Administration from 1919 to 1923, and in 1920 founded the Belgian American Educational Foundation. And we have here in the top right, kind of an iconic image of a Belgian relief ship. So a ship filled with food and supplies headed across the ocean to provide relief to the starving citizens on the European continent. And the Mission Inn was headquarters for the local Riverside branch of the California Committee for Belgian Relief. But it was thanks to Miller's own political associations and the Mission Inn's international reputation as a luxury hotel that he became acquainted with Hoover and subsequently Galpin. During and immediately following the war, Miller organized public lectures by prominent Belgian diplomats and American relief workers, including W.L. Honnold, who was Hoover's immediate successor at the Belgian Relief Commission. From 1916 to 1920, the hotel hosted Belgian senator and peace advocate Henri Lafontaine, we see up here in the top left, former secretary of the Belgian embassy and assistant to Hoover for Belgian Relief, Hugh S. Gibson, down here looking very dashing, and Hoover's Food Administration special advisor and, quote, right-hand man, Dr. Alonzo Taylor, who is seen up in the top right. And these are articles describing each of the men's visit to the Mission Inn and their presentations that they gave there. So by the end of the war, Miller was acquainted with an expansive network of powerful men in both countries that enabled him access to the material that he desired. So as a result of these relationships, Miller's post-war letter to Herbert Hoover looking for aid in obtaining an object from Belgium for his Mount Rubidoux Memorial plan did not go unanswered. After Miller's initial letter to Hoover, it was Perrin Galpin who scouted the artifacts, acted as translator, and brokered the deal between Miller and St. Pierre's priest, Chanoine de Lair. And through his diplomatic contacts, Galpin obtained permission from Belgian Cardinal Désiré Joseph Mercier and King Albert to remove the relics from St. Pierre's. And just as an aside, Cardinal Mercier himself became a very potent symbol of the Belgian resistance for his vocal stance against Belgian occupation and the violence inflicted upon Belgian civilians. And here we have a great poster, once again from the Food Administration. Cardinal Mercier has appealed to the Food Administration for more food for starving millions, eat less wheat, meat, fats, and sugar, ship more to the war-stricken people of France, Belgium, and Italy. And then off to the right here, we have King Albert I. So as Miller's grandson, Frank Miller Hutchings, recalled, quote, "It was found that the Church of St. Pierre of Ypres, Belgium, had been badly damaged during the enemy bombardments of 1914, and that funds were needed to repair the church fabric and to administer to the starving people. So for a donation of $500 toward Belgian relief and payment of packing and shipping fees, in August 1920, the cavalry was officially Miller's." And so here we have a shipping invoice from Antwerp, Belgium to New York. And the cavalry was sent from Antwerp to New York under the auspices of the Commission for Relief in Belgium and arrived in San Pedro in September 1920. It was transferred to a bonded warehouse on North Alameda Street in Los Angeles, where it stayed until 1922, when Miller made adequate room for it on site at the Mission Inn. And thanks to another letter from Hoover to Treasury Secretary David Houston, who coincidentally as Secretary of Agriculture, had been Miller's guest at the inn in June 1919. So once again, through these extensive networks that he had created over the years, U.S. customs officials allowed the cavalry into the country without any consular invoice or customs dues. So Miller ultimately decided that the decapitated statues of Mary and Peter were too badly damaged and perhaps in poor taste to include in the memorial, but his success in purchasing the cavalry inspired him to plumb St. Pierre's for more war treasures. Although Father Dallaire was increasingly less accommodating, Miller attempted to purchase another bell from the church, and then Miller decided he didn't like the bell, and he attempted to also buy a number of scrap pieces of metal from other bells from the church, but they haggled on price, and eventually Miller gave up trying to secure more church materials when they couldn't agree on a price that was suitable for both men. So in one aspect, we see that Miller's acquisition of the cavalry really represents an impulse to comprehend local involvement in a global conflict that took place thousands of miles away. It was an attempt to shrink the distance separating the local public from the Riverside soldiers who lost their lives on European battlefronts. Though Miller undoubtedly wanted to honor the fallen soldiers and construct the memorial, as he said, as a symbol of world democracy, it was also a convenient and timely means for him to garner some publicity. By placing his memorial, or his proposed memorial, on Mount Rubidoux, which already included monuments to Father Sarah and Henry Huntington, Miller controlled the memorial's design and could utilize it as an attraction for inn guests. And Miller's goal, in true Frank Miller style, was to make his memorial one, quote, such as has not been built in this country. It was his objective to create the first and best World War I memorial in the United States, and to do so with as much fanfare as possible. So when the cavalry arrived in Riverside in 1922, he set about organizing a grand and highly publicized event for its dedication. And his first letter was to none other than Belgium's King Albert, writing, quote, "The day of dedication will be a high day in California. From every section of the country, people will journey to witness the exercise. Men high in authority will take part. The Associated Press will send its accounts of the services to all parts of the world. Pictures will be taken. We feel that because of the heroic part of Belgium played in the war, and because this memorial speaks so eloquently of what your nation passed through, Your Majesty should be represented." In June 1922, Miller additionally wrote to Lou Henry Hoover, wife of Herbert Hoover, asking for the Secretary of Commerce's involvement in the dedication ceremony, as well as seeking the Hoovers' help in soliciting Cardinal Mercier to perform the cavalry's reconsecration in its new California home. So from 1918 to 1922, the Rubidoux Memorial and Miller's plans for it, and the shipment of the cavalry and its arrival in Riverside are consistently in the news. However, there's kind of a cliff. After 1922, the project is all but abandoned because it was thwarted by a lack of bond funding. So municipal bond funding did not come through. The memorial project fell by the wayside. So even without the memorial, Miller still connected Mount Rubidoux to the war effort by organizing annual Armistice Day services on the mountain from 1919 to 1935, which featured patriotic music, religious sermons, and flag dedications for nations allied with the Triple Entente. And here we have some great images from those services in the mid-1920s with the flags and the crowd. So those were, what he organized at that time to honor the war dead and the service people who fought. So in January 1934, Miller briefly reinvigorated the monument project. And this is only, a year and a half before Miller's death. So he enlists his daughter Alice to go in search of the cavalry, which had been lost in the Mission Inn's storage maze for over a decade. So this piece, which had been, at the forefront of so much of what Miller was doing in 1922, is now, By 1934, they don't even know where it is. So on January 15th, 1934, a handwritten memo from Alice Miller Hutchings, his daughter, states that the cross was found uncrated in a storage room under the alley of the workers' dormitory across the street from the main mission building. So in kind of a reinvigorated effort to acquire city bond money, Miller wrote to the now former president, Herbert Hoover, asking him for a letter stating, quote, stating that you fully approve of the idea of placing it on our mountain as a memorial to the soldiers of the Great War, and also that it is from the Church of St. Peter of Ypres, Belgium. A word from you will accredit it with the people of Riverside for all time. So Hoover complied with Miller's request on January 29th, 1934, but his letter of support did little. So here we have some correspondence between Miller and Hoover. Miller's first letter from January 26th and Hoover's reply on January 29th. So Hoover got back to him pretty quickly. So for a time after Miller's death in June of 1935, the Calvary hung as a decoration on the inn's exterior. And when the hotel was sold outside the family in 1956, Miller's grandson, Frank Miller Hutchings, donated the cross to the Hoover War Library at Stanford in honor of Hoover's work to bring the artifact to Riverside from Belgium. And I'll give a quick plug for next week before we move on to, don't miss next week to learn about the Riverside Memorial to World War I that did get built. So that will be next week. So we have this long, somewhat convoluted story about this cavalry coming from Belgium to Riverside. So what do we make of it? What are these historical connections that we can make, right? The war memorial that Miller planned never came to fruition, and this artifact was eventually lost in storage for over a decade. So what are its connections to these wider contexts? Why should we care about this, right? Well, first off, Miller's connections to influential diplomats working for Belgian relief cannot be overlooked. More importantly, we can't overlook the centrality of US aid in post-war Europe as a way in which the US government sought to spread American ideals and solidify democracy after the war. So at the war's end, Woodrow Wilson championed the formation of a peaceful global community that was based on, as historian Emily Rosenberg has stated, quote, a world dominated by American values and held together by American-based institutions. And historians of US imperialism have also widely noted that the American influence was most directly spread through non-government private corporations, volunteer service organizations, and relief organizations that proliferated abroad in the Great War's aftermath. So the American Relief Administration, for example, distributed over 4 million tons of relief materials to 23 European countries in the war's aftermath. Post-war international relief organizations used food, medical supplies, and funds for rebuilding also as a way to weaken radical movements that potentially threatened US interests. So, for example, during his time as head of the American Relief Administration, Herbert Hoover utilized this system to attempt to turn Russian citizens away from Bolshevism. Hoover strong-armed Lenin to allow his administration to directly distribute food to starving Russians and blocked other relief organizations that were potentially sympathetic to the Bolsheviks from providing aid. And we see here some great images of distribution of bread following the war, as well as this great flour sack, Belgian relief flour, hearty thanks from Belgians to the Moody and Thomas Milling Company. So we can't overlook the importance of these relief organizations, and really it's through Miller's connections to people involved in these relief organizations that he's able to have access to the cavalry in the first place. Secondly, although the US suffered great human loss from World War I, the country was in the war for a very short time, and it was not fought on American soil. And as a result, at the end of the war, the US was in a relative position of strength, and many American art collectors utilized this position to gain access to European art collections that had previously been locked away in the great houses of noble families. They weren't available, they weren't on the market until the war disrupted things, causing causing these many families to need to sell their art pieces. Others, were forcibly taken. So the outbreak of the Great War was a boon for U.S. art museums, dealers, and collectors who directly benefited from the conflict's turmoil. Fearful of looting and theft, museums and galleries in the Allied nations often sent artworks abroad across the Atlantic for safekeeping. And with the European art trade all but shut down by the war, aristocrats and art dealers alike, desperate for money, turned to bargain hunting American collectors. As London-based art dealer Charles Carstairs noted in 1915, quote, "England acquired her great masterpieces during the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, and now America's opportunity has come." And I think art historian Cynthia Salzman, she further elaborates and really sums it up in saying the war, like others before it, this was not the first time, this was just America's turn, right? Caused an upheaval in the possession of art, forcing paintings out of the hands of those trapped in the crossfire. And it created a huge buyer's market for bystanders and victors, those with the means to purchase these paintings. So as a result of World War I, some of America's most prestigious private art collections and art collectors, such as Isabella Stewart Gardner, Henry Clay Frick, Samuel Kress, they acquired many prized pieces during the war with the guidance of European dealers who were, hungry for sales to stay afloat. So Miller's collecting budget, we have to put it in perspective. It was a trifle compared to the purchasing power of America's nouveau riche industrialists. But the Mission Inn's collections did grow as a result of this booming wartime art trade. So in 1917, for instance, Miller acquired Vincenzo Pagani's 1532 canvas, The Annunciation, from Marshall Field and Company's art department. So for over 250 years, the painting had been part of the art collections of the Monterubiano Collegiate Church, which was a Catholic parish in the artist's hometown on the eastern Italian coast. And beginning in the early 1800s, it was successively bought and sold by a number of noble families in Italy and England. Most notably, the one that caught my eye the most was a French cardinal, Joseph Fesch, who was living in Rome, who was actually a great art collector and an uncle to Napoleon Bonaparte. So fun fact. So at the Great War's eruption, the painting was, The Annunciation, seen here, was on exhibition at a Berlin art gallery. So it shipped the piece to a satellite store in Florence, Italy, following Germany's declaration of war. The Italian government was in discussions to purchase Pagani's masterwork for the State Museum in Urbino when Italy formally entered the war, and the acquisition process was halted. After the Urbino Museum's failed purchase, the Florentine Gallery sold the painting to the Marshall Field department store in Chicago, from where Miller bought it. And so we have this great picture of the Galleria in the Mission Inn. Obviously, we have the wonderful Tiffany windows and William Keith's California Alps. And over to the side here, sorry, no. Sorry about that. Over to the side here on the left, we have the Annunciation. So this piece was exhibited at the Mission Inn until about 1970, when the hotel's then owner Benjamin Swigg sold the painting to the J. Paul Getty Trust. So they sold it. Benjamin Swigg was able to sell it to the Getty. The painting stayed in the Getty's collections until 1984, when it was actually repatriated to the Galleria Nacional del Marche, the museum that had originally attempted to acquire the piece from the Florence Gallery at the beginning of World War I. So it all came full circle, and the painting got to where it was its original destination. So Miller's opportunistic collecting during and after World War I was not the first time he and other members of his family used conflict to benefit the Mission Inn's collections. Two of the inn's most famous pieces, the Nanking Bell and the Reyes altar screen or reredos, were available for purchase because of national uprisings. So the Nanking Bell was purchased by Miller's daughter Alice and her husband DeWitt Hutchings in 1912 after returning home from an extended tour of Asia. And it was acquired in the midst of the political and social upheavals of China's nationalist revolution against the Qing dynasty. The Hutchings secured the Nanking Bell after meeting a representative from a large US importing company on a steamship from Hong Kong to Shanghai in January 1912. As DeWitt Hutchings later wrote, quote, "We told him of our bell collection and that the large bells of China made us envious, and that if by chance any time he should find an oversized temple bell that wasn't needed, he must let us know." So after DeWitt and Alice returned to Riverside in March of 1912, the importer contacted them about his findings in Nanking. So in the midst of these nationalist uprisings, the bell was found in the ruins of a temple. As DeWitt later remembered, quote, "We had hardly returned home, March 1912, when we got a letter from him showing pictures of a huge bell lying on its side among the ruins of a building. His letter stated that the bell was in Nanking in the ruins of one of the principal temples destroyed in one of the recent revolutionary battles. We said nothing to Mr. Miller about this find, and his surprise and delight were good to see when this 2-ton bell entered the court on a truck some months later." So the Reyes altar screen, or reredos, is perhaps the most ornate and famous piece in the hotel's collections. And it was up for sale in the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920. And before we take a brief look at the Reyes altar screen, before Miller successfully acquired this, DeWitt Hutchings, once again Miller's son-in-law, in conjunction with Mission Inn curator Francis Borton, who you could have a whole talk on him as well. Well, the two of them hatched plans in 1914 to go to Mexico during the national unrest to gather as many Spanish paintings as possible. So they drafted a memorandum to Miller describing the revolution's possible benefits and their plans for going and securing old Spanish masters. As DeWitt writes, quote, "With this state of affairs, it occurred to me it might be possible now to get some valuable old pictures from Mexico if the right man were attending to it." So Hutchings and Borton proposed bribing soldiers and priests, as well as outright looting abandoned churches to obtain choice pieces for the hotel. And DeWitt goes on to lay out his plans to Miller. "In some cases, it might be possible to bribe the soldiers as they are about to loot a church to save a picture or two. In other cases, it might be possible to pay the priests who know their church is about to be sacked and who need money to escape with. In still other cases, a church might have been sacked and the priests might have all gone, and there might be a chance to go in and take pictures." So the plans for that stop there. While Hutchings and Borton's plan, they never materialized. It was 6 years later, in late 1920, that Miller began the process of acquiring his most prized piece, this Reyes altar screen. So on December 30th, 1920, Miller received a letter from his buying agent in Mexico. He had people in different areas, scouting things for him at different times. And his agent in Mexico was Margaret Crane, who was also a sometime employee of the Mission Inn's curio shop. And she alerted him to this carved altar screen that had recently been put up for sale by a Madame Louisa Alcazar. And Miller is intrigued by Crane's find and asks her to have it as fully photographed as possible for his inspection. In March 1921, Crane sends Miller a detailed photograph stating, "At last I have a photograph of the altar to send you. It gives you an idea of the carvings and figures, but the beauty of coloring, the gold leaf, and the draperies on the figures you can only imagine. I doubt if there is an altar in the US as beautiful." So after haggling over price, Crane successfully secures the Reyes altar screen from Miller. The only problem is Crane's initial request to Mexican customs authorities to ship the reredos to the US is firmly denied because of the piece's artistic, cultural, and historical significance. Crane, however, is undaunted by the government's original refusal, and she writes Miller on April 6, 1921, that it would simply take a 200 peso bribe to smuggle the screen through to Texas. In later correspondence between Crane and Miller, Crane states that she had the altar shipped from Juarez across the border to El Paso in the name of the Mexican owner, Luis Alcazar, not in the name of Frank Miller, because, quote, the officials in Juarez are not as fussy as when the goods are shipped out in the name of an American. So after arriving at the Mission Inn, the Reredos, would become the crowning jewel of Miller's collection. And of course, today, the stunning piece is still one of a huge draw for the inn, especially for those looking in the pre and post-COVID world to have a wedding in the chapel. So once again, what we see in the case of the Nanking Bell and the Reredos, and to a certain extent, the Belgian cavalry, is this rescue argument to justify the removal of cultural property. And this is, of course, especially in, as we look at the Nanking Bell and the Reyes altar screen, tied to these pervasive paternal colonial ideas. These artifacts and art pieces would be destroyed unless saved by foreigners who could ensure their safety and care. It's, once again, another version of this white man's burden that we see coming up as a justification for colonial endeavors during this time and before. And we see this continually running through collecting practices and cultural trade of this time and beyond. So to continue our road to making some larger connections here, some final food for thought, and are these questions surrounding ethical collecting practices, the provenance of art and artifacts in museum collections, and the impact of war on the illegal looting and transfer of cultural materials, and is something that museums are increasingly grappling with. From as far back as the 1907 Hague Conference, international law has sought to prevent the looting of cultural material during wartime. But even though these treaties are in place and overseen largely by the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, this certainly by no means means that looting doesn't happen, right? Look no further to the Taliban's destruction of the monumental Afghani Buddhas or the looting of the Iraq National Museum in Baghdad during the 2003 US insurgency. I mean, there's any number of examples recently that we can look to. And from the most prestigious cultural institutions, such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, there's now a call to better vet how their cultural items were obtained and to return cultural materials that were obtained in potentially dubious ways. So in 2019, for instance, the Metropolitan Museum of Art returned an Egyptian sarcophagus that had been on exhibit for 2 years after it came to light that it was sold to the museum by a global art trafficking network and stolen from and smuggled out of Egypt in 2011. The Cleveland Art Museum has been in the news continuously since 2012 for acquiring Mayan, Roman, and Greek antiquities from unclear provenance from an art dealer formally convicted of falsifying documents. And they also voluntarily returned a Cambodian sculpture when research uncovered that it was potentially stolen during Cambodia's years of violent civil unrest beginning in the 1970s. And even just yesterday, if you were reading the news, there was an article regarding the Musée d'Orsay in Paris returning a Gustav Klimt painting to its original owners, or the descendants of the original owners, after research uncovered it had been looted from an Austrian Jewish family in 1938 by the Nazis. So there's also a current and urgent call currently to revise colonial narratives and repatriate items obtained through colonialism. Recently, the Belgian Museum of Central Africa, whose collections were largely plundered during the country's reign of terror in the now Democratic Republic of Congo, completed a multi-million-dollar renovation to revise the museum's colonial narrative, although the reviews have been decidedly mixed as to whether or not the museum actually achieved this goal. At home, institutions here are reevaluating their collections, the way they were acquired, and the narrative surrounding them. examining as the Hammer Museum at LA, so it just down the road from us, has stated with their current initiative, Reimagining the Museum, quote, "There is an urgent call for equitable, just, and anti-racist practices within museums and art institutions." So hopefully tonight, by taking a close look at one artifact, well, we actually ended up taking a look at about 4, but one very closely, and its journey to Riverside in the aftermath of World War I, we can really see the national and international reverberations of post-World War I collecting, memorialization, internationalism, and American global influence. So I thank you very much for joining me.
Okay, thank you very much. That's really fascinating. We have a couple of questions, but before we go to those, I have one, and I'm still trying to formulate it a little bit, but I wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about Francis Borton, both in regard, to just his role, and then very specifically, I'm thinking about the number of Spanish colonial paintings that are in the collection and whether or not we know any of those have a direct tie to Borton in regard to the things that you had to say about his comments and DeWitt's actions.
Yeah, so Francis Borton was from around 1912. He was listed as the Mission Inn's curator, and he also organized the curio shop. So the Mission Inn's kind of antique store, souvenir store that operated in what is now, what is that, the Glenwood Landing down there. So Borton had an interesting history. He was trained as a Methodist minister, but then he went to Mexico and he became like a rare book dealer down there. And the correspondence between him and Charles Fletcher Lummis is really fascinating. And because Borton is attempting to sell Lummis a number of Spanish volumes for the LA Public Library when Lummis was the director of the LA Library. And Lummis doesn't have very many complimentary things to say about him. He says that if I can remember the quote right, he wheedled all the old books out of Mexico and sold them at a very high price. So the sense is he's a bit of a wheeler dealer. And, there's even, he sent Lummis, an idol from a grave, so he was potentially literally grave robbing. So, there's no evidence that his plan with DeWitt in 1914 to go down to Mexico and essentially steal things ever came to fruition. They were in talks with a Mexican art dealer, Ignacio Galvin, down there, but they couldn't ever come to an agreement on what to do. There isn't anything that evidence that Miller really gave much credence to their plan or gave it a green light. So it really stops. There isn't any evidence that I have found that they went through with anything. It's just this, their ideas and the way they are talking about these things that I think is important to sort of uncover, that they're thinking that at this time it's okay to do this. They're seeing it as an opportunity, and that's something at this time that many people did think, and as we see continuing today, many people still do.
Okay, thank you. So now, if you have a question, please, we have a few, so I'll start with those, but there's still plenty of time to type in a question if you have one. So I'll start. Jennifer Kolb actually just asked for a clarification. She says, did you say the Calvary was in the Hoover Presidential Library?
That's the last I know of it. It was we have the documentation between Frank Miller Hutchings and the Hoover Library when in 1956, I believe, they donated it to the Hoover Library. And Steve Spiller, former executive director, former collections manager of the Mission Foundation, I know tried to get a better hold on the whereabouts of it now. I'm not sure if it's still in the Hoover's Institute's collections, but the last we knew of it, we do know that in the 50s it was donated there before the hotel was sold out of the Miller family.
Okay, thank you. So we have two questions that are kind of similar about the Reyes altar. So I'll kind of combine those. They come from Rose Monhay and Sherry Bachman. And they're asking if there is any credible evidence of Mexico trying to get the altar returned.
Not that I know of, no. And I mean, this is, we have the, in the Frank Miller Hutchings collection, there is, the documentation of, it was sold by a private owner. So it was a private sale. And, I don't know exactly how much force they, at the time, the Mexican authorities would have, how forcefully they would have, what's the word I'm looking for, pursued it staying in the country. Margaret Crane, who's another, interesting figure that we don't know too much about, but who was involved in collecting for the Mission Inn and working at the curio shop. She doesn't seem too fazed by their initial refusal. So no, I don't think so. And we have, for all of these items, we, at least the ones that I'm discussing today or discussed today, we have, there's correspondence and there's, in some cases, shipping invoices. And so it's, not necessarily that, they were taken and looted, they came to the inn illegally. It's just that the opportunity was there because of these conflicts that were going on. So it just, putting that in a broader context, war is a way in which cultural materials transfer hands quite frequently.
Okay, so there's a couple of questions that are a little more directly related to the sourcing and the documents. So I'm going to combine those a little bit as well. Walter Parks asks, did many of the documents you cited, like the invoice, come from the Mission Inn Foundation archive? And then I think Eric Beecham has a similar question. I think, Eric, if you're not asking about the documents, please retype your question. But Eric asks, what's the source for the smuggling of the retablo out of Mexico? So maybe you could just elaborate a little bit on the archival collections that you used.
Yeah, so all of this is in the Frank Miller Hutchings collection, which is now the Museum of Riverside, and I think now at the library, the Riverside Public Library, being held while things are being restored. And so yeah, so they are all there, and it's correspondence between Miller and his various people that are informing him about things. So yeah, so we have the documentation and back and forth between Miller and Margaret Crane regarding the Reyes altar screen. We have back and forth between a lot of documentation between Miller and Perrin Galpin, and Miller and Father Delaire, who was the priest at St. Pierre's a church in Ypres. So we have all of these back and forths, and then we have information after the fact. Miller discussing Hutchings discussing how the bell came from China. So there is the real-time documentation in the Frank Miller Hutchings collection through that. So those were the main correspondence that was utilized.
And then again about the Reyes altar, Linda Ward asked, do you think that the private sale argument is valid? Didn't the Mexican government ultimately approve? Now, I think you sort of addressed this a little bit, but maybe more explicitly. Do you want me to read it
Yeah,
again?
so I mean, yeah, so it was, ultimately, it came here and it was most likely approved. And there wasn't any, there were no other issues. So, yeah.
And then we have a comment from Steve Leck, one of our well-known local citizen, local history scholars. Thank you, Steve. I'm going to go ahead and read this. And he's quoting one of our local history scholars who predated all of us, Joan Hall. So he says, according to Joan Hall, the Archdiocese of San Francisco and the Archbishop, this is in regard to the cavalry, sorry. According to Joan Hall, the Archdiocese of San Francisco and the Archbishop offered the statue to the Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Los Altos, California. The directories of cemeteries, Catholic cemeteries, made arrangements in December 1972 for the statue to be transported from Hoover Institute to the cemetery. It was stored in the Gate of Heaven Cemetery for several years until it was determined that restoration was impractical due to years of deterioration. Consequently, the Belgian statue was dismantled and discarded. And that's a direct quote from Joan.
Oh, okay.
So thank you, Steve,
Thanks,
for
Steve.
that. And Eric, I don't know if you just heard that, but he wants to know, did the Belgian church ever ask for the return of the cross?
Not to my knowledge, no. They used the funds. I mean, they were, at that point in time, they were interested in money to help rebuild. So it was a Miller through Hoover and through Galpin is kind of looking for places in Belgium because of its cultural significance at this time, looking to Belgium for someplace who would be willing to part with some items that he could use that would be appropriate for this memorial plan that he was thinking of. And so they wanted funds to rebuild their church. So in 1924 the church was reconstructed. So that's what Miller's $500 was going to be used for. So it wasn't they were viewing it as a donation to rebuilding the church. So no one has, it was that was a sale that was brokered and all parties seemed to be happy with the results. Everybody got what they were looking for out of that.
Okay, well, we don't have any questions, and that seems to be a pretty good place to stop for today. So I know that we all give Emily a big round of applause and say thank you so much for that deep dive into 4 Mission Inn artifacts. And we thank you very, very much for that. There's one more question.
Nope.
Yeah, let's see. Actually, it's just a comment. So thank you, our audience, for commenting and letting us know that you enjoy things. So thank you very much, Emily, for all your hard work on the project and for this excellent presentation tonight, and to all of our visitors, attendees tonight. We hope to see you again next week when, as Emily kind of previewed, we will hear 2 speakers again next week, Mark Levitch from the National Gallery of Art and the head of the World War I Memorial Inventory Project will tell us about memory and World War I memorials across the country. And then Vince Moses will tell us the story of Frank Miller and the Soldiers Memorial in Riverside. So thank you all again for being with us, and have a pleasant evening.
Thank you.